Welcome, travelers, to Adventures in Security, where we delve into the 30 principles of trustworthy and secure design. These principles are derived from NIST Special Publication 800-160, Volume 1, Revision 1, which provides a disciplined systems engineering approach to building secure and trustworthy systems. In other words, we don't add security at the end. It's an emergent system property that we must engineer from the ground up. Like safety or reliability, security must be integral to the entire system lifecycle, not just bolted on. If you like what you see and learn something, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe so you don't miss our future content. Today, we'll explore NIST's 30 design principles for trustworthy, secure systems. These principles serve as guideposts for architects and engineers to mitigate vulnerabilities and manage risks. Our narrative will tie these principles into a cohesive story, illustrating how each contributes to building systems that stakeholders can trust with their critical missions. As the NIST CSRC explains, these principles help security and engineering teams implement measurable protections in a manner aligned with mission assurance. The principles are grouped according to the overall intended objectives: simplicity and modularity in design, minimizing the attack surface; least principles and more, isolation and access control architecture; depth, diversity, and resilience; continuous protection and fail-safe design; and detection and response. Before we begin, remember, these principles aren't rules or a checklist. They must be balanced based on system context, stakeholder risk tolerance, and available resources. In a real project, you must tailor and prioritize them thoughtfully. Modern IT systems are undeniably complex, making them challenging to secure. Our first principles address this by emphasizing simplicity, clear structure, and modularity in design. The goal is to make systems easier to understand, analyze, and trust. The design principles involved include clear abstractions, reduced complexity, structured decomposition and composition, compositional trustworthiness, and substantiated trustworthiness. Large systems should be built on clear, simple interfaces and abstractions. This principle reminds us to hide unnecessary complexity behind well-defined interfaces. By designing modules or components that present clean abstractions, we enable easier system inspection, testing, and analysis. For example, consider a complex web application. Using transparent abstraction layers such as UI, business logic, and data access with stable interfaces makes it easier for developers and security reviewers to understand each part's behavior. Similarly, NIST stresses that systems should be as simple as possible and free of unnecessary complexity. Every extra feature or convoluted process can introduce new vulnerabilities or make assurance harder. A minimalist design is more straightforward to secure and validate. As the saying goes, complexity is the enemy of security, so we aim to design for simplicity. For example, avoiding convoluted workflows or overly complex class hierarchies in software. Simpler systems have fewer hidden failure modes and are more amenable to rigorous analysis. The system should be composed of manageable pieces and built in a structured way. Using modularity and layering is key. We decompose the system into components or modules, each handling a cohesive set of functions, and then compose those elements in a disciplined manner to deliver the overall capability. We avoid a jumble of interdependencies by enforcing a structure, for example, layering network architecture into presentation, logic, and data layers with strictly defined interfaces. The NIST guidance explicitly highlights the use of modular design, layering, and partial ordering of dependencies, such as avoiding circular loops where module A depends on B, while B depends on A to maintain a coherent design. Even if each module is secure on its own, we must consider the system as a whole. Compositional trustworthiness deals with the emergent properties of composition. We cannot assume a system is trustworthy just because all its parts are individually trustworthy. When modules interact, new behavior emerges and new security issues often follow. Think of multiple secure microservices that, when integrated, could expose an unforeseen vulnerability at their interface. Compositional trustworthiness entails evaluating and justifying trust at each aggregation level. The trustworthiness of a set of components together is an emergent property. It might be weaker or occasionally stronger than that of any individual part. We have to treat the composed system as a single unit for assurance purposes, validating that the whole still meets security objectives. Evaluations of a system's trustworthiness are predicated on proof that the requirements for reliability have been met. Substantiated trustworthiness requires that trustworthiness should not be presumed. Instead, it should be demonstrated by facts that unequivocally demonstrate how trustworthy an organization is. This makes it more likely that an entity will only ever be trusted to the degree it deserves. Commensurate rigor and cautious mistrust are necessary to prove trustworthiness, i.e., system elements are assumed guilty unless proven innocent. A design mentality that treats all aspects engaged in the design context, that is, a system element, and the elements with which it interacts with mutual suspicion, is a hallmark of substantiated trustworthiness. Mutual suspicion like this reflects cautious mistrust, which is the belief that something undesirable, unexpected, or unwelcome is likely to occur. Every system component should be designed with a lack of confidence in itself or in interacting aspects. The following situations are covered by this suspicion, which is predicated on. The design of the system element of interest is based on the non-performance of the components it interacts with, and how that non-performance can affect the behavior and results of the component of interest. This is known as interacting element suspicion or mutual suspicion. The design for the system element of interest must consider its non-performance independent of any external influence. Designing to mitigate mutual suspicion is reinforced by applying the principle of least privilege to all entities, ensuring that each element executes with only the necessary privileges, thereby minimizing the harm that may be created. Additionally, the principle of least persistence is applied to ensure that each element is minimally exposed. Self-monitoring and built-in actions, such as testing at the element's inception, may be part of designing for self-suspicion. This method compels the system designer to expect things to go wrong and to diligently look for evidence that the design works if something goes wrong. Among the factors taken into account for system element non-performance are the anticipation that components will act and yield results that deviate from their intended design, and the limitations, presumptions, and prerequisites related to reaching threshold performance. In practice, these simplicity and structure-oriented principles translate to design heuristics such as keeping your attack surface small, keeping your design modular, and avoiding unnecessary intricacy. A simpler, well-structured system is inherently easier to secure. With that foundation, let's move to another central theme: minimizing what a system exposes and permits. In other words, the least principles and other ways to shrink the attack surface. One of the best ways to secure a system is to limit what it can do, what it exposes, and who or what can access it. By eliminating unnecessary elements, we reduce opportunities for attackers. NIST includes several least principles, long-standing pillars of secure design, exactly for this purpose, including least functionality, least privilege, least persistence, least sharing, minimal trusted elements, and minimized detectability. The system and each component should operate with only the functions and features absolutely required to achieve its objectives and nothing more. Unneeded features or code should be removed or disabled. Every additional feature is a potential entry point for bugs or misuse. For example, If you're deploying a database server that only needs to serve queries, you would disable or omit any unused modules, like a web interface or extra debugging services. By doing so, you remove code that could contain vulnerabilities. This principle aligns with the idea of a slimmed-down, purpose-built system. As NIST states, a component should accomplish its required functions and nothing else. Each user, process, or component in the system should have only the minimum privileges necessary to perform its duties, and no more. If a module only needs read access to a config file, it shouldn't have write access. If an administrator needs to manage a single application, they shouldn't be given root access to the entire server. By enforcing least privilege, we contain the blast radius of any compromise. If an account is hijacked, the attacker gains only limited capabilities. Practically, this means rigorously setting access controls, utilizing role-based permissions, and avoiding accounts with excessive privileges. Least privilege is a direct counter to the common pitfall of convenience, where apps run as administrator or users share the same high-privilege login. Instead, granular privileges keep the system safer. The least persistence principle pertains to time. Components or resources should be accessible or present only for the duration required and not persist longer. For instance, if an IoT sensor only requires network access when sending its hourly data, it can remain disconnected or powered down for the rest of the time. Or ephemeral access tokens should expire quickly when no longer needed. The idea is to limit the window of opportunity for an attacker. By minimizing persistence, we reduce the system's exposure. In practice, this could mean automatically logging out idle sessions, using one-time use credentials, or spinning down services when they're not actively in use. Lease sharing stipulates that components should share resources with each other only as minimally as necessary, and with as few different components as possible. Shared resources, such as common databases, memory, or hardware, can become channels for unintended interaction or interference. By limiting sharing, we prevent a compromise in one component from easily affecting others. For example, rather than multiple applications running under the same user account and sharing the same temporary directory, we provide them with separate accounts and isolated storage. Lease sharing dovetails with concepts like isolation and segmentation. Each part of the system should have its own sandbox. If done correctly, even if one part is breached, the attacker can't easily pivot to another because there are no implicit shared resources to abuse. Collectively, these four are often called the least principles. They all aim to strip the system down to its essential mission, and nothing more. Think of carving a sculpture from a block of stone. You remove all the pieces that don't contribute to the figure. Here, we remove anything not contributing to the system's necessary function or security. The benefit is twofold. Fewer features permissions means fewer things can go wrong, and it also makes it easier to understand and trust the system's behavior, since there are no mysterious extra capabilities hidden inside. Another principle in a similar spirit is minimal trusted elements. This one applies the least mindset to the system's trusted computing base. Only a minimal set of components should be inherently trusted to maintain security. If possible, push functionality out of the fully trusted kernel or base so that the impact is limited even if non-core components fail or are subverted. For example, instead of a single massive monolithic application with unfettered access to all data, and thus fully trusted, you might structure it so that a small, security-hardened module handles sensitive tasks. At the same time, everything else runs with constrained trust. The fewer elements we designate as trusted, the easier to evaluate and secure them rigorously. Another interesting angle to approach surface reduction is minimizing detectability. A system can be more secure if the adversary cannot easily find or track it. This principle says a trustworthy system should not be blatantly detectable or observable on open networks. That might involve not advertising services when not needed. For example, disabling unnecessary network service banners or responding to pings, randomizing certain behaviors, or using moving target defenses so that an attacker scanning the network can't even be sure your system is there or what its characteristics are. If attackers cannot map out your system, it significantly raises their work factor. For example, a server might deliberately throttle or modify its response to port scans, or necessary devices might reside in segments that aren't publicly addressable at all. While security through obscurity alone is insufficient, limiting your system's visibility is a valuable layer of protection. It's akin to having an unlisted phone number. It doesn't guarantee no one malicious will find you, but it certainly reduces unwanted attention. By implementing these minimization principles, least functionality, privilege, persistence, sharing, minimal trust, and low detectability, we drastically narrow the avenues an attacker can exploit. We essentially shrink the attack surface to only what is absolutely necessary. Real-world secure systems, from hardened operating systems to high-assurance microkernels, exemplify these ideas by eliminating bloat and operating with tight, minimal privileges. Now, even a minimal, simple system needs robust mechanisms to enforce boundaries. Next, let's discuss how we separate domains and control access within a system, building on these least privilege concepts. To achieve security, it's not just what you have in a system, but how you partition and control it. Several NIST principles focus on isolating different parts of the system and managing interactions, ensuring that a flaw in one area does not automatically compromise another. The key principles of isolation and distributed control include domain separation, hierarchical protection, distributed privilege, and mediated access. Domain separation involves logically or physically separating different domains of the system, allowing their security needs to be managed distinctly. In practice, a domain can refer to different privilege levels, network segments, or execution environments. For example, consider a system that has a public-facing web interface and an internal database. Domain separation would involve placing these in separate network segments, such as DMZ versus internal network, with strict controls in place between them. Or in an operating system, separating user mode and kernel mode is an example of domain separation. Code running in user mode cannot directly affect the kernel without going through controlled interfaces. The goal is to contain potential failures. If the web interface is compromised, the database domain still has its own protections and isn't fully exposed. Hierarchical protection assumes that not all components are equally trusted, and that's okay. In a secure design, we establish levels of trust in a hierarchy. Highly trusted components are positioned at a higher tier and require strong protection, whereas less trusted components are kept at a lower tier. Crucially, a less trusted component should never be able to compromise or require protections from a more trusted component fully. In a hierarchy of trust, each level defends against anything from below. For instance, in a multi-tier application, the database, which holds sensitive data, might be considered more trustworthy than the front-end web server. The web server's compromise should not directly jeopardize the database. The database may require additional authentication or checks, even from the web server. The hierarchy principle also means layering your security like a castle with inner and outer walls. Each inner layer assumes the outer layer could be breached and is prepared to defend against lower trust elements. Essentially, more trustworthy components, the inner circle, are treated as almost sacrosanct. They are simpler, well-guarded, and assume the outer circle might be hostile. Inspired by principles such as the separation of duties, the principle of distributed privilege means that no single entity should have complete control over performing critical actions. Instead, privileges are distributed among multiple components or persons, requiring their cooperation. A classic real-world analogy is having two officers with part of a nuclear launch code. Both are needed to authenticate a launch. In computing, an example might be requiring two administrators to sign off before a server's configuration is changed, or having a multi-party protocol where several separate services must each approve a sensitive transaction. The point is to prevent unilateral control. If an adversary takes over one component or account, they still can't wreak disaster without breaching others simultaneously. By distributing privilege, we introduce checks and balances. This also ties into consensus and coordination. System-critical decisions or operations are only authorized when the designated separate parties or components all agree that the action is allowed. Mediated access means controlling all resource access through a mediating mechanism, typically a security control or reference monitor that enforces policy. In practical terms, this principle means there should be no backdoors or unchecked pathways. Whether a user is reading a file, an application is querying a database, or a microservice calls another, access should be mediated through a secure mechanism, such as an operating system enforcing file permissions or an API gateway enforcing service access rules. The mediator verifies that the access is allowed according to policy. This principle echoes the classic security concept of complete mediation, which requires checking every request for a resource. For example, rather than an application directly connecting to a data source, it might go through an access control service that logs and validates requests. By mediating every access, we limit the ability of malware or unauthorized users to bypass security checks. If someone attempts to escalate privileges or traverse to a different part of the system, the mediator intervenes to block or filter the action, such as a kernel or guard process. In summary, these principles establish a robust structural defense. We compartmentalize the system into isolated domains, establish layers of trust, require collective agreement for critical actions, and ensure that every interaction is vetted. The result is that an attacker can't easily jump from one part of the system to another, can't gain total control by capturing one account, and can't access assets without passing through security checkpoints. Such architectural decisions significantly increase adversaries' work factors and mitigate the damage if a breach occurs. We've effectively erected walls, checkpoints, and security protocols inside the system's design. Now, let's turn to another set of principles that complement isolation, ensuring we have multiple layers of defense and resilience so that the system can tolerate failures or attacks gracefully. No matter how much we minimize and isolate, we must assume that at some point something will go wrong. A defense will fail or an attacker will find a way in. Consequently, we must ensure that the system is not relying on just a single line of defense and can withstand failures without collapsing. Principles supporting these efforts include defense in depth, diversity, and redundancy. Defense in depth is a foundational security strategy. Employ multiple layers of defense so that if one mechanism fails, others still stand. The idea is to prevent or at least significantly slow down an adversary's progress. For example, consider protecting sensitive data. You might have network firewalls, encryption, user authentication, and monitoring and intrusion detection. Only if all layers are bypassed or fail would the attacker reach the prize. According to the NIST, the defensive components should be coordinated to prevent losses collectively. That coordination is essential. The layers should complement each other, covering different attack vectors rather than being identical. Each layer buys time to respond and mitigates different kinds of threats. Defense in depth acknowledges that no single security control is foolproof. Proper security comes from a belt and suspenders approach with overlapping safeguards. Diversity or dynamicity means using diverse methods and components in your defenses. Homogeneity can be a weakness. If all your defenses are of the same type, a single exploit or flaw could take them all out. Diversity can be applied in various ways, such as using different technologies. For example, two firewalls from different vendors to mitigate a common software vulnerability, varying configurations, or even dynamic defenses that adapt over time, hence dynamicity. The goal is to avoid common mode failures. If an organization uses multiple cloud providers rather than one, a specific platform vulnerability won't compromise all their systems. Or using a mix of operating systems in a server cluster can reduce the chance that one malware strain wipes out the entire cluster. Diversity injects uncertainty for attackers. They can't craft one universal exploit that fits everything. It's akin to biodiversity in nature helping resist disease. A uniform crop field might be devastated by one blight, whereas a mixed forest stands partly resilient. In cyber terms, you can implement diversity by having layered defenses of different kinds, such as firewalls, intrusion detection, and application whitelisting. And by designing systems to avoid monoculture, the use of devices and operating systems, all from the same vendor. Redundancy involves having backup components or capabilities so that if one fails or is compromised, others can take over. In safety-critical systems, this is standard. For example, an airplane has redundant control systems. In cybersecurity, redundancy refers to having duplicate servers in different locations, so that one DDoS attack or outage doesn't stop service. Multiple DNS servers or mirrored databases. It could also mean redundant communication paths, where if one network link is cut, traffic reroutes via another. From a security perspective, redundancy helps ensure availability and can also deter attackers. Even if they take down one node, the system as a whole survives. However, redundancy must be implemented carefully. The backups should be as secure as the primaries. An attacker will target the weakest link, and not introduce new synchronization or consistency vulnerabilities. The NIST notes explicitly the use of both security and operational redundancies to limit single points of failure. For example, you might have two authentication servers. If one is compromised or crashes, the other continues to enforce logins, or redundant firewalls in case one is bypassed. Combined, defense in depth, diversity, and redundancy fortify a system's resilience. An attacker who might penetrate one layer finds another in their way. Depth. If they craft an exploit for one technology, it won't work on the next. Diversity. Even if they manage to disable one component, a backup keeps things running. Redundancy. This multifaceted resilience is crucial in today's threat environment. We assume that breaches will happen or components will fail, so we plan for graceful degradation rather than total collapse. It's worth noting that these principles align well with cyber resiliency strategies, as elaborated in NIST's cyber resiliency guidelines. Anticipating and withstanding attacks and failures is central to trustworthiness. Next, we'll discuss principles that ensure the system handles failures and adverse events in the most secure way possible. In other words, even when things go wrong, they fail safe rather than fail dangerously, and recovery restores security. It's not enough to have strong defenses. We also need the system to behave safely during and after failures or attacks. The next set of principles ensures that security protections are uninterrupted, by default on, and fail-safe in nature, including continuous protection with protective defaults and protective failure, protective recovery, and trustworthy system control. Continuous protection asserts that protection mechanisms should work continuously whenever a component is operational. Security isn't something that should time out or only work intermittently. It must be always on for as long as needed. For example, if data encryption is a protection mechanism, continuous protection means that the data should never sit unencrypted simply because the system state has changed or a process has crashed. It covers all system states and modes, whether the system is starting up, shutting down, under heavy load, or even in a degraded mode, the protection should not end abruptly. The NIST notes that continuous protection also implies that protections are coordinated and non-conflicting across the system. Two sub-principles provided by the NIST include protective defaults and protective failure. Protective defaults mean the system's default configurations are the most secure ones. If a component is out of the box, it should start in a hardened state, not an open one. This principle is sometimes phrased as secure by default. For instance, an account should be created with no privileges until they are explicitly granted, rather than all privileges being granted until revoked. Or an installation should have all optional services turned off unless the administrator enables them. By having safe defaults, we ensure that even if an operator forgets to configure something, the system isn't left exposed. It's essentially anticipating human error or oversight and making the secure choice the easy or automatic choice. This is extremely practical. Many real incidents happen because default passwords were never changed or default settings left a door open. Protective defaults aim to eliminate that risk. Protective failure or failsafe stipulates that when a component fails, it should fail in a way that minimizes further damage. The system should default to a safe state rather than, say, crashing open. For example, if a security control, such as an antivirus or firewall, encounters an error, it should block traffic, denying access by default, rather than allowing all traffic through unchecked. Or if an application crashes, it should not dump sensitive information to the screen or logs for an attacker to read. NIST emphasizes that a failure should not result in an unacceptable loss of information. In other words, even a failure shouldn't compromise our overall safety and security goals. We also want to avoid single points of failure that are catastrophic. Designing with graceful degradation in mind helps here. For example, a sensor detecting a dangerous condition should err on the side of triggering an alarm, even if it might be a false alarm, when it fails rather than err on silence. Failsafe defaults often mean denying access by default and requiring an explicit OK for actions. So if something goes wrong, the default action, deny, kicks in and protects the system. The protective recovery principle states that after a failure or security incident, when the system recovers, it should not resume operation in an insecure state. Recovery procedures should restore protections without introducing new vulnerabilities. If a server restarts after a crash, it shouldn't start with debug mode enabled or security controls disabled. Or if data was corrupted, perhaps the system should verify its integrity before trusting it going forward. Protective recovery might include actions such as restoring an automated system to a known good state, or gradually bringing systems back online while verifying their integrity. The key point is to avoid a scenario where recovery itself creates an opening for attackers, which has happened. One example is a service returning online in a reset state without a prior security context, allowing someone to take advantage. We want the system to heal back to a secure posture. This principle, along with protective failure, aims for resilience. Even under stress or after an incident, the system remains as safe as possible and quickly reestablishes full protections. Recalling that it was mentioned under continuous protection, trustworthy system control refers to having mechanisms that ensure every critical action is under reliable control and cannot be tampered with. Essentially, think of this as implementing robust reference monitors in the system. A reference monitor is an element, hardware or software, that controls access and is itself verifiable and protected from tampering. The principle of trustworthy system control states that all security enforcing components, such as the mediators we discussed or any enforcement mechanism, must be designed to be resistant to subversion and testable for correctness. They constrain all controlled actions and protect themselves in the process. For example, an operating system's kernel enforces access control. For it to be a trustworthy control mechanism, it must be protected from user-level tampering and ideally proven correct, or at least highly assured. This principle is closely tied to assurance, encouraging us to design our security controls with high assurance through testing, analysis, and perhaps formal verification, so that we can trust them to govern the system effectively. When you put these pieces together, continuous protection, secure defaults, fail-safe failure handling, safe recovery, and rock-solid control mechanisms, you get a system that maintains its security stance even when something goes wrong with these principles. In such cases, the device defaults to blocking traffic, protective failure during the glitch. When power is restored, it boots up with all security rules active, protective recovery and defaults intact, and continues to monitor without interruption, providing continuous protection and trustworthy control. From the user's perspective, the system remained secure throughout the incident. We design systems not only to be secure in steady state, but also to handle minor to catastrophic events securely. This dramatically increases overall trustworthiness. Stakeholders can trust that even in adverse conditions, the system won't betray them by lapsing in security. Component self-reliant trustworthiness, as defined in the context of the NIST Special Publication 800-160 Volume 1 Revision 1, refers to the degree to which a system component or element can maintain its trustworthy behavior independently, particularly when it is isolated from other components, or when the broader system is under duress, fault, or attack. Self-reliant trustworthiness emphasizes that each system element should be capable of sustaining its secure, predictable, and correct operation without over-reliance on external dependencies. This contributes to the overall trustworthiness of the system by ensuring that the compromise or failure of one component does not lead to cascading failures or a breach of system integrity. Key attributes of a component's self-reliant trustworthiness include: the component can enforce security policies internally without requiring continuous external validation. The component is designed to prevent faults or compromises from propagating beyond its boundary. It can withstand unexpected events, including cyber attacks or hardware failures, with minimal degradation of function. And it avoids extensive reliance on other components or shared infrastructure to maintain trustworthiness. Our final set of principles, detection and response and proportionality, centers on understanding what's happening in the system and responding accordingly. Even with all precautions, attacks or anomalies will occur. A trustworthy and secure design must be able to detect these events and react in a measured and effective way. Additionally, the effort we put into security measures should be commensurate with the risks, a concept of proportionality that the NIST highlights. Principles in this category include anomaly detection, commensurate response, commensurate protection, commensurate rigor, commensurate trustworthiness, and loss margins. At its core, a system should be capable of detecting when something's not right, such as when there's a salient anomaly in the system or its environment, the purpose of anomaly detection. This could be a sign of an attack or a fault. Timely detection is critical because you cannot respond to what you don't know about. The NIST defines anomaly detection in terms of having a model of correct behavior and spotting deviations. For example, an intrusion detection system, IDS, monitors network traffic for patterns that don't match normal usage, or a server monitors its own performance metrics for unusual spikes that could indicate malware. Effective anomaly detection often involves three components: a basis of correctness, a definition or model of normal versus abnormal; data collection, the gathering of telemetry or events from the system; and data interpretation involves analyzing the data to determine if it's anomalous. In practice, anomaly detection can range from simple threshold alarms, such as CPU usage exceeding 90% for an extended period, to sophisticated machine learning models that flag unusual system calls. The principle ensures that a trustworthy system is not blind. It is self-monitoring and can alert or take action when something unusual occurs. Detection alone doesn't stop an incident. It must be coupled with a commensurate response. The principle of commensurate response means the system's responses to incidents or anomalies should be proportional to the threat and potential impact. In other words, don't underreact, but also don't overreact in a way that could cause more harm than the attack. For example, if a minor anomaly is detected, such as a single mistyped password, the response might be a gentle warning about the retry limit. In contrast, detecting a major breach might trigger automatic account lockouts or network isolation. The NIST describes considering the aggressiveness of responses relative to severity. We should plan a range of reactions from graduated, least aggressive first, escalating as needed, to ungraduated, the most aggressive action immediately if the threat is dire and time-critical. For example, a graduated response to a suspected malware infection could start by isolating the affected host from the network, then, if confirmed, proceed to shutting it down or issuing a system-wide alert. A commensurate response ensures we contain or mitigate the threat effectively without unnecessary collateral damage to the system's mission. The commensurate protection principle is about aligning the strength of protective measures with the potential impact of their failure. In simpler terms, the more damage something could cause if it went wrong, the stronger the protection around it should be. We perform risk assessments and identify the most significant adverse outcomes and then ensure our safeguards for those are proportionally robust. For example, if a system function could lead to catastrophic loss, such as a control system for critical infrastructure, you would employ very high assurance layered protections for that function, including certified hardware security modules and multi-factor authentication. For a less critical function, you might accept a lesser degree of security measures that's commensurate with its lower risk. This way, resources are allocated where they are most needed. Essentially, don't spend $100 of security effort to protect a $1 asset, and conversely, don't guard the crown jewels with a flimsy lock. In practice, commensurate protection may involve using stronger encryption for highly sensitive data, dedicating more resources to monitoring critical servers, or applying stricter development practices, such as formal methods for safety-critical code. It ties the security level to the impact level. The principle of commensurate rigor asserts that security engineering activities themselves, design, testing, assurance processes, should be carried out with a level of rigor that matches the stakes. If the system requires a high degree of trust, we must apply very rigorous methods, deep testing, code review, verification, to gain confidence in it. For lower criticality systems, lightweight methods might suffice. This principle posits that our engineering process and assurance depth should scale with the required trustworthiness. For example, for a nuclear reactor control software, one would insist on mathematical verification and extensive test evidence, high rigor, whereas for a low-risk internal tool, basic testing and best practices might be enough. Rigor entails the scope, depth, and detail of activities. Therefore, commensurate rigor means we choose the scope of review and depth of analysis appropriate to the severity of the failure. It prevents both over-engineering and under-engineering of security. You wouldn't, for instance, go through a years-long certification process for a simple website that displays public data, but you absolutely would for a pacemaker's control software. The commensurate trustworthiness principle posits that a component's level of trustworthiness should be commensurate with the most significant adverse effects it could have. This is akin to saying that if an element is in a position where its failure can cause considerable damage, that component itself must be designed to a higher standard of trustworthiness, with greater robustness, assurance, and so on. You assign trust in a system component only up to what it has earned. For instance, a simple sensor that cannot cause significant harm if it misbehaves might be considered adequately trustworthy, even if it's not built to the highest standards. However, a subsystem that manages cryptographic keys, whose failure would compromise the entire system's security, must itself be highly trustworthy, perhaps utilizing dedicated secure hardware, rigorously tested code, and redundancy, corresponding to the high impact. Commensurate trustworthiness ensures we aren't overly trusting components beyond what their role justifies. These commensurate principles together enforce a balance. Our protection strategies, our incident responses, and our assurance efforts are all calibrated to risk. This is very practitioner-oriented. It's about spending your security resources wisely and reacting appropriately. A trustworthy design isn't one size fits all. It intelligently adapts to where the most significant dangers lie. Finally, loss margins refer to the engineering practice of identifying and maintaining safety or security thresholds, essentially buffers or tolerances, between the normal operating state and a failure condition or security compromise. In cybersecurity design, this manifests as the margin between acceptable system behavior and catastrophic loss. It involves applying protection and assurance rigor proportional to the potential impact of a failure, ensuring there's sufficient headroom before reaching a critical state. That's it for this video. If you have questions or comments, post those in the video discussion. And until next time, be careful what you click.